first things, maybe a couple of apologies. Number one, I hate this title. It suggests a 10-volume work rather than a 15-minute talk. But what I'm going to really be talking about is a very small segment in social science that deals with the way that humans behave, the way that our rationality works. And also, I should say I'm not a social scientist. So I'm coming at this from the outside. I'm a religious ethicist. I study religious ethics, the way that groups develop and maintain and challenge norms. So that's where I'm coming from. Okay, so essentially the problem that I'm looking at is one that I think we've kind of run up against a lot of times over the course of the conference. And that is that in the holy texts that the great monotheistic traditions use as scripture, there are commands to love, right? To love everyone. And yet we find religious individuals and religious groups not fulfilling these commands, not loving each other. And we also find texts that are used in order to justify those kinds of actions, right? So what I'm looking at is not so much, what is normative in the community here, which is what my academic background would suggest. Instead, I'm trying to figure out what are at least some of the reasons why this happens. Can we go to the next one, please? All right, so where it says Igious ethics there, that's supposed to be religious ethics. The way that this works in religious ethics usually is that the discipline came out of philosophy and theology. And I bring this up not because you should care about the way that academic studies in religious ethics work, but because I think this is the way that many of us think a lot of the time, or at least assume that other people think. And so the picture there is supposed to be an image of the way that this works. And the idea is that we are self-consciously rational beings. We know our preferences, we know our theologies or philosophies, and we essentially approach life through our worldview, and we're relatively consistent in that. And so that if we want to change something about ourselves or change something about someone else, what we need to do is change their mind. And there are some analogs to this in various branches of social science. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, I was going to read that, but I don't think I will try to. But in economics, the classical model, Homo economicus, the idea is, and this is Herbert Simon, it's from him, who actually, he's describing this idea. He actually was one of the earlier people to challenge it. But the idea is that in classical economics, human beings are assumed to be rational. They have preferences and they act in order to maximize the benefits that they can find in a particular situation. Go to the next slide, please. Another one. So this is a classical position, very important in the 80s, by Lawrence Kohlberg. And here the idea is one of moral development. And the idea is that the way that human beings come about morality and their moral positions, the way that they think about ethics, is developmental in nature. That as a very young child, what we do is we obey. And then as we get a little bit older, we conform to conventions. And then as we get older still, we're able to develop these abstract ideas and then apply them to various situations. So again, this is another form of social science and another way of getting at something that's pretty similar, this assumption that human beings are reasoning agents first. If we could go to the next slide, please. But I think the way that this has been coming out more recently is a more nuanced model of the way that this works. And it's often called a dual process model. And so here we have it. On the left there, that's supposed to say intuition. And then on the right, reasoning. So on the right, this is a kind of summation of Homo economicus, or the rational individual. Okay, so this is system 2. Slow, serial, meaning that we deal with one concept at a time. controlled, effortful. It's something where we have to actually think about what we're doing actively and expend some mental energy on it. Rule, govern, flexible, neutral. But what's been introduced is this idea that there are actually two systems. Now, this isn't necessarily two areas of the brain that function at different periods. It's kind of two modes of being rational. And on the left, we have intuition. So it's fast, parallel, meaning more than one thing is happening at one time. Automatic, we do it without even thinking about it. Effortless, for example, when you hear what's 2 plus 2, you know that it's 4 without even trying to think of the answer. And in fact, it's almost impossible not to think of the answer. It's associative, and this is where I'm going to try to make some points later. And there the idea is that it's not serial. When we think of a concept, we associate it with a whole bunch of other concepts at the same time. So when we hear a word, it's going to have a certain emotional valence. And a whole bunch of things might come to mind at once instead of just that one concrete term by itself, apart from other relationships that we draw to it. And then slow learning and also emotional. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so some important ramifications of this. The way that this works in terms of the two systems is that system one comes first, that we first make these quick judgments and associations and then think about them later. So this is a major point or insight into the book, and I'm trying to remember who brought this up yesterday, but by Jonathan Haidt, who Righteous Minds. And the idea is that, like I said, we have these intuitions first, then we think about them. The mind prefers to be in a state of cognitive ease, which means that we like it when our intuitions are just kind of functioning naturally, and we don't have to think too much about them. We're not challenged. Our preferences just seem to kind of fall in line with the way things are going. Whatever stereotypes we have up and running are being confirmed. And we don't like cognitive dissonance, meaning we don't like it when there's some kind of tension in between more than one concept or more than one belief that we have. We want things to be consistent. Just intuitively, we want that. Reason is often motivated, meaning that when we do use reason, a lot of the times we're not after the truth. Instead, we're after something else. So one of the kind of most famous experiments all the way back in the 50s, which is confirmed every time I coach a baseball game or watch a sporting event of any kind, is called They Saw a Game. And the idea is that there was a football game between Princeton and Dartmouth, and these researchers started interviewing a whole bunch of the students afterward and looking at what was written in the student newspapers and so on and so forth, and figuring out that Dartmouth fans and Princeton fans actually saw a different game in many respects. They interpreted the flow of the game differently. They thought that certain times there were penalties should have been called, or there was roughing by one person and this caused roughing by another person later. And I think that this is something that we can confirm and experience, that if any of you have children and they play baseball, you'll experience this, or any other sports, soccer, that anytime there's kind of any marginal call, our reason kicks in pretty quickly to try and justify why we're right in that instance, or our team is. And then, as far as moral reasoning goes, it's often the case that, just like in other kinds of reasoning, that we make a judgment right away, we have intuitions right away, and then later reason kicks in to kind of justify our intuitions. This isn't necessarily always the case, but often. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so that's supposed to say, now I was going to talk about a number of ways of thinking about moral reasoning. I'm just going to talk about one called cultural cognition theory. And there's actually a cultural cognition lab at Yale University run by Dan Kahan. And so we bring back motivated reasoning, remember, which is this idea that when faced with a question, we often approach it subconsciously in terms of not getting after the truth, but getting after something else, whatever that might be. And this is combined with what he calls identity protective cognition, meaning we don't like it when our identities are challenged. And whatever we get our identity from, all the various aspects, it can be any number of things. We want to feel secure in that identity. We want to feel secure in our tribe, like like Kelly Clark was talking about. We want to feel secure in our kinship relationships, and so on and so forth. And any time that that's challenged, it's going to tend to bring in motivated reasoning to a larger extent than other times, as a reaction to this challenge. And then naive realism. So this is the idea that we're realistic about other people's biases and the way that their reason functions, but we're naive about the way that we reason. So this is very close to what Dr. Clark said regarding the fundamental attribution error, where there's a kind of different standard for other people than for ourselves. So it's easy for us to pick apart someone else's argument. Oh, aren't you just getting at it from some other kind of motive or something? But it's hard for us to see our own motives. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this all have to do with love and religion? Think for a moment about Syrian refugees. And what image comes to mind? What feelings? What kind of arguments? What kind of voices do you hear? Next slide, please. Is it something like this? Now, this would be a lot more effective if I had a big collage of a whole bunch of different images, but I couldn't do that because my email would not send them. It was too large of a file, so now I only have one. But think about all the other images that you might have seen on television or in some kind of print media or electronic media. Fathers holding up their kids as they're trying to get off a boat in Greece, or children who've been the victim of a bombing in Syria, or any of these other kinds of images. Next one, please. Or is it something more like this? I trust no one in this room probably comes up with this image, but trust me, plenty of people do. Or if it's not this image exactly, and again, if I had a collage, it would be much more effective, but what you would hear on Fox News and so forth is all these refugees coming over, they're all young men. Where I don't know where they're getting this kind of information, but this is what you see on the news. And so plenty of people are going to have this kind of association when they hear about Syrian refugees. It's going to be associations that are threatening in some way, shape, or form. Go to the next one, please. So my question is, how do the way that our associative memory and thinking work, how do those affect the way that we love? Well, if our associations are geared toward the first group, compassion for refugees is going to be easier. If it's more toward the second one, where we feel threatened, then it's going to be harder to feel compassion toward those people. And the people that I've talked to who are against allowing Syrian refugees into the country, and this is just one instance, argue that, well, look, ISIS is going to try and sneak some terrorists in. And what's the really loving thing to do, considering what our responsibilities are, is to protect our citizens. And therefore, we shouldn't allow Syrian refugees in the country. So the way that our associations work can often not necessarily dictate, but influence the way that we reason about things. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So a few ways that I think that this thinking about things this way can be helpful. Number one is just having an awareness about this can help us to understand some of our own biases and so forth. There's an interesting test you can take online called the Implicit Associations Test, and there are all kinds of different ones. You can take one on what kind of associations do you draw regarding Arabs or regarding African Americans and violence, and so on and so forth. And it kind of can reveal to you some of our biases. And some of our biases are not going to be the same as the way we consciously think about things. For example, plenty of people who would say that it would be a bad thing to associate African Americans with violence will implicitly draw associations to African Americans and violence nonetheless. And plenty of African Americans do this too. And that's what this test can help reveal. So just being aware of that we can function this way, I think, is helpful. It also, I think, it can push us to be more empirically rigorous. So for example, when the person I was talking to who said, Syrian refugees, we don't know very much about them. And we're scared that ISIS is going to sneak people in. Or when Donald Trump says tens of thousands of males are coming from Syria and we don't know anything about them. Well, we can research that and figure out if that's actually true, and clearly it's not true. I mean, there was a 60 Minutes special a couple weeks ago about the extremely rigorous vetting process that immigrants from that area have to go through in order to get over to the US, and less than 1% make it through this vetting process. So clearly that's not true. Oh, it's fixed, thank you. So I think that this is one way also of kind of challenging the way that sometimes our associative memory can kind of play tricks on us. It's also very important to seek out opinions with which we disagree. Not only as a way of kind of a mental exercise, but it can change our associations over time. Some of my family members, I think if they would watch MSNBC instead of Fox News for the next 5 years, they might change their mind a little bit. Importance of practices and embodiments. So if we're not just self-consciously rational beings, then the kinds of things that we do with our body, the kinds of physical places we put ourselves, the kinds of spiritual practices that we engage in, like the interfaith amigos we're talking about, all those become extra important. And then, as more than just a practice of ourselves, if we're going to talk about the way we might influence others, this has been a recurring theme in the conference. The importance of having just situations and just policies is incredibly important. Because think about if let's say you're a villager in Yemen, and you're asked, well, what do you think about the United States? And associations start to kick in. What is that person going to probably think about? Drones, right? The fact that a drone killed someone that I know, maybe someone very close to me. And not only is that going to reflect on the United States as an abstract entity in a person's mind, also when they think about democracy, perhaps that's going to be tainted by those things. When they think about Christians, because the United States is still considered a largely Christian country. So it's not only that justice is important on its own face, which it is, but there are certain ways in which I think that this model of the mind makes it important for justice to foster further just relationships. And then finally, the Socratic method is a little bit better than appeals to objectivity. And the idea here is that with motivated reasoning, with this kind of identity protection, when someone's identity is threatened by appeals to, well, why can't you be more objective? It's not as helpful as if you can get the person to come to a new kind of opinion on their own. So instead of me saying to that person, well, you don't understand our immigration policy regarding Syria, and that's why you think that we shouldn't let Syrians in, they're going to get defensive and start arguing on behalf of their position. But if I might say something like, oh, I watched an interesting 60 Minutes clip on that a couple days ago, you might check it out. I learned some things from it, so might you. Maybe this would get them to kind of come around on their own without getting as defensive. So, and then I just had one more screen with a few, if we could switch the slide. If you're interested in this kind of thing, here are a few resources that are pretty well known. So, thank you.